Today's podcast is with Dr. Sandro Calvani from Bangkok, Thailand. Sandro Calvani is a former United Nations diplomat, Caritas executive writer and university professor, and is president of the Scientific Council of the Giuseppe Toniolo Institute for International Law of Peace. Dr. Calvani is also an esteemed member of RJI's Global Advisory Council. Welcome, Sandro. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And you've been with us so long, actually, on our advisory council. I can't even remember when you actually joined. But I always ask our guests, how did we meet?
My last assignment in the United Nations has been to be the director of the United Nations International Crime and Justice Research Institute, which has a mandate to research international right. And of course, restorative justice is one of the solutions to many of the problems of unjust justice. Every country has justice in its system, but many of them do not have just justice. And restorative justice is one of the solutions. Therefore, I contacted the network to encourage all the members to strengthen their network and share their knowledge and their experience in order to help their own countries to implement restorative justice.
Yes, and I remember when we first connected, it was actually on LinkedIn, and I remember you invited me to write for your publication at the time, Freedom from Fear, which I thought was such an interesting name of a publication, and you published a couple of our articles. I really appreciated that. And then some years later, I came back to you and asked you to join the council, and I was just thrilled to have you come on. So thank you for that. And so tell us more about your background, especially as a UN diplomat.
I started to work with the World Health Organization in humanitarian affairs in Africa. Therefore, I was involved in in-depth knowledge and experience in the field of all the disasters, human-made disasters, that was armed conflict, and natural disasters, which destroy the human community in such a profound way that I became interested in ways to prevent all of that instead of just repairing after the disaster. And by visiting a number of African countries, I understood how little they knew about instruments which are available in the United Nations system in order to prevent the happening of all these very bad things. Now, this was more than 30 years ago. Nowadays, the United Nations has prepared a number of tools which are appropriate to deal with the risk of armed conflict and other kind of disaster which happen in so many countries in the world. Unfortunately, the most powerful countries in the world, which are the members of the Security Council of the United Nations, are the first ones not to apply the principles that the United Nations has approved with very large majority. Some of the principles even are approved by consensus, that means by unanimous vote. And that means that those countries have committed themselves to respect these principles, and they did not. I remained in the United Nations more than 20 years, still continue to work on this subject. I dealt with various kinds of international crimes with the United Nations Drugs and Crime Program, and then the United Nations Drugs and Crime Office. And I finished my career with UNICRI, dealing with scientific research and political research on instruments of justice.
Yes, perfect. And so let's move on to talk about the primary topic today, and that's about the Ukraine war. And you wrote a wonderful article on the subject, and it's called I actually forget a little bit of what it's called. It says the Compass of Peace. I think it was. I think it had a little bit more than that. But can you talk about that article, what you said and your main points in that article?
Since the latest wars of the past century, I make reference in particular to the Vietnam War and all the other wars which came after the World War II, the international community has recognized that peace is not just the absence of war. Peace is something much more complex and requires a lot of preparation and can be built only if it is founded on four fundamental pillars. Those four fundamental pillars of peace were suggested by the Roman Catholic Pope John 23rd in 1963. It was April, so it is exactly almost 60 years now. And that the document, for the first time in the history of the Catholic Church, was proposed not to the people, believers of the Catholic religion, but it was sent to all peoples of the world and all men and women of goodwill. For that reason, it has now been deposited in the United Nations in New York and not in the Vatican in Rome. The four pillars which were proposed and then accepted by so many people who replied to the Pope are the truth, the justice, the charity, and freedom. These are fundamentals because without truth, you cannot build any form of justice. You cannot, without justice, which is the second pillar, you cannot implement any kind of freedom and charity and love among people. So these are fundamental pillars because if we do not agree on what is true and what is not true, it is absolutely impossible to create justice. If you don't define who is the offender and who is the victim, it's probably impossible to enter in any court because you don't know where the victim should sit and to whom the judge and the defendant should reply. Yes. So this is extremely important, and the United Nations provided tools in order to facilitate the recognition of these principles. Nowadays, more than almost 60 years ago, we see that now these principles are no longer accepted by everybody at international level. So the Security Council of the United Nations often put a veto on definitions. Like, for example, a resolution cannot be mentioned as the war in Ukraine. Now, everybody knows that there is a war in Ukraine. And there is a member country say, no, there is no war, there is no invasion, there is nothing like that. The same happened with reference to other members of the Security Council, China, the United States, who also did not respect the principle of the United Nations and did other invasions, like in the case of Iraq, in the case of Afghanistan. On the other side, much less known, there are cases in Africa now, for example, Somalia and Kenya, here in East Asia, Thailand and Cambodia, who went to an international court of justice, put their issues, their territorial issues or other kind of conflict, which was not an armed conflict. So conflict by itself is not an evil, as far as it does not become hate and victims and violence. So other countries put these issues in front of the International Court of Justice and ask the justice to establish what is the truth, what is it real and what is unreal. And there the Court of Justice decided, okay, this country should give back this land to the other country. It was illegally taken. And then both countries achieved to have freedom for their own people and for a recognized government, and they became, they built peace among them. This is, of course, the fundamental also of reconciliation, which is necessary for any other kind of justice, including restorative justice.
Right, right. Excellent, excellent. And let me just put this out too. As you know, it was actually March 7th, RJI put out a very simple statement about the Ukrainian war. And that was very early, but we talked about the sovereignty of nations and how important that was, and also about remembering the victims and the impact on the victims and communities during this war. So where are we now, Sandro? Where are we now? I mean, here it is April 28th and so much has occurred. So where do you think we are now?
Start from the international point of view of the international law, starting from the resolution that you have mentioned, a large majority of United Nations members, 145 countries, have passed a resolution recognizing that it is an abuse of sovereignty of Ukraine, and therefore it is an invasion. 5 countries voted against it. A few days ago, after a long lack of action from the United Nations, the General Assembly has passed a new mandate. From now on, whenever the Security Council veto some determination related to an armed conflict, the General Assembly immediately will have a mandate to call those countries in the General Assembly to justify what they're doing. This is rather innovative. It's the beginning of a reform of the United Nations system, and I hope that it will continue fast. We are now in a situation of more than 7 million displaced people inside the country and more than 5 million refugees in other countries. So it's becoming a major conflict. Millions and millions of families are suffering. Children are involved. Women have been affected badly as victims. Now, this kind of truth is difficult to establish during a war. It will take some time, as always it happened in the case of the International Crime Court. More than 25 countries of the UN system has requested the International Crime Court to investigate what is ongoing, and they claim that war crimes have happened, and they have requested the ICC to collect evidence of that and start the case. When this will start, not yet, they started the collection of evidence, but they've not started the case in court yet. When it will happen, it will become clear who is the offender and who is the victim. At that point, the process of justice could start. There are some other international rights often forgotten, not only sovereignty that you have mentioned already, also the right of resistance. It has been recognized since before the United Nations system. Every people have the right of resistance. Even if Russia would be the ruling government in Ukraine and would be no other government in Kiev, still the people of Ukraine have the right of resistance to a government that they don't want. Then there is the responsibility to protect. Also the responsibility to protect, which was established during the war in the Balkans in the 90s, accepted by unanimous vote by the United Nations, and therefore accepted also by the Russian Federation and the United States, established that when a people is unable to protect itself, when the government is unable or unwilling to protect their people, other countries have the responsibility to protect the human rights in that people. Of course, a resolution of the Security Council is requested to that, and that would be the right solution, to put United Nations troops, peacekeeping troops, in that conflict in order to obtain a ceasefire and stop the fight. This is what should be done, and is not done, unfortunately.
Right. And so you kind of touched on this already, but let's go a little bit deeper about war crimes, about, I guess, to define what war crimes are in this circumstance. Can you go even deeper into that?
Yes, the Geneva Convention established very clearly a number of behaviors which armed forces cannot do. Civilians cannot be targeted. Corridors to allow people displaced to leave the war area should be established and protected. Civilians cannot be submitted to lack of food, lack of water, so they cannot be encircled in an area for them to die for simple lack of water or lack of food. People who work in health, protecting the wounded people, should not be considered as a possible target. So it is not allowed to target health officers, to target hospitals, schools, and in any other institution which is not part of the war. So the Geneva Convention is very, very clear about it. And it is very simple to establish whether a crime war has happened or not. Also because nowadays the technology which is available at international level provides evidence much more stronger than what it happened in the past. And so those countries who have claimed that crime wars have happened, what crimes have happened, will have to put their case, and then the ICC will decide.
Yes, and so as we look at what we're seeing take place during this war, again, going back to restorative justice, when we put our statement out, it seemed, it was very early and during this war. At that point, it might have even been seen as a conflict in March. But the idea of offender accountability, we think it's so critical to hold offenders accountable and as directly as possible. And do you think that the whole concept of restorative justice in this circumstance with war, that it's applicable and that it's possible to actually use those the principles and specifically talk about restorative justice now?
Everybody knows the principle of restorative justice. And in this present moment, exactly right now, I don't think it is applicable right now because there is not the clear definition of who is the offender and who is the victim. If one of the two parties involved in this conflict do not recognize who is the offender, who is the victim, of course, it's very hard to start that principle number 0, let's call it. Then we have the other 3 fundamental principles. Should finally the party accept that there has been an offender and there is a victim, then they have to accept also to encounter, to repair, and to transform. This will be also very hard in the present system because I don't see the attempt to encounter. The leaders of these two countries have not met before the war, and they never met during the war. So simply they don't want to talk each other. Then the repair issue in this case is truly big. The disaster which has been made, the destruction of public property or private property in a country which is quite developed. So it is not a developing country. There is a lot of destruction. That means billions and billions of dollars or euro, as you wish, have been lost. So repair, it will be another very hard component. And then transform, which is, of course, the necessary step to go towards reconciliation. So it is a journey. And restorative justice is not a sentence in a tribunal. It is a journey. And of course, the parties have to accept to walk together in this journey. Yes. We have not seen it in big conflict applied so far. So restorative justice has not been recognized at international level as a possible tool to reduce armed conflict. I think it should. There is an International Council of Human Rights in the United Nations. I think the United Nations should also create an International Council of Restorative Justice in order to offer the member countries this tool for them to encounter, repair, and transform in order to build reconciliation. So far, the countries have not seen this kind of peaceful, non-violent way as a solution to the debates and their discussions.
Yes, and I was thinking also of other conflicts, well, actually specifically the genocide in Rwanda and the use of restorative justice principles there, bringing victims and offenders together.
Yes, that happened, but that happened afterwards.
Yes, it did.
So it was not a tool to reduce the conflict before the conflict. It was to me is too little and too late.
True.
Because when women have been raped in numbers, hundreds of thousands, children have been killed and so on,
True.
of course, that came better than nothing, of course. It should be proposed once we have a ceasefire. And I'm sure that those, if there will be any war crime recognized, I'm sure that those victims will welcome the opportunity to encounter the perpetrators and come to a journey of repair and transform.
Yes, and in this situation, I do think it would be new, don't you, to apply it now if it was considered seriously?
Yeah, of course, it would be a big news. Unfortunately, what I've listened in the G20, in the G8, in the Security Council, it's always a reference to the past, no?
Yes.
How it was done in Vietnam, how it was done in Afghanistan, how it was done in... Okay, if we always make a reference to the past, the so-called precedent, we always solve the problem of the present and of the future with solution of the past, which have been proved to be ineffective. It does not work to solve a conflict among countries with war, with armed conflict. It has never worked. It never has been a solution. So these important countries, the major economies of the world, like the G20, for example, should accept that these tools are available. Take the case, for example, of a self-determined people, Kosovo. Kosovo has been self-determined. Well, 10 of the 20 members of the G20 have not yet recognized the self-determination of Kosovo. So in that condition, of course, again, it is impossible to establish who is the offender and who is the victim. So instead of looking to the precedent, we should look to the future and start a new process. And somewhere we have to start. If the place to start is Ukraine, I would be very happy because this is a European country and would be another opportunity for Europe to show how 70 years of peace have been built between countries who are always at war: Hungary, Austria, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. They're always at war for 1 century. They forgot and forgiven the past, and they've started a new path of peace. And the new path of peace of Europe has been the largest group of democracies in the world. It has become the biggest economy in the world and the most educated peoples in terms of advanced education in the world. That shows how peace being built as prevention of war also work for all the rest. And there are other threats to the world. The world should now concentrate on other risks like the climate change, the pandemics. These are areas where we should build better justice and freedom, not by killing each other.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I was just thinking as you were talking that who would be a key, in essence, facilitator that would need to be on board to use the restorative justice principles now with Ukraine and Russia? Who do you think?
Well, my personal thinking would be that should be a human being or a human institution with a very high credibility at global level. It could be a committee of previous Nobel Peace winner of the Nobel Peace Award. It could be authorities of a religion like the Dalai Lama or the Roman Catholic Pope, any other people who are seen really independent and not on one of the two sides.
True.
Then the victims, of course, could self-organize and initiate themselves by demanding and declaring that they want this process. And of course, by a call from the victims, we will then have to listen to the reply, to the answer from the offender. So this is the way to initiate, like it happened in any other kind of personal restorative justice, also in the case of community, the same approach should be applied.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. And so we're drawing to the close of this short conversation. So do you have closing comments?
As you can see, for those who are listening and seeing also the video, I'm no longer a very young person. So I have seen some of the worst tragedy of humankind. I have in front of my eyes those situations. I've been emotionally disrupted by those situations. I think that modern humankind in this very moment has an opportunity to take back the global public goods, like our resources, climate, public health, education. What makes the Homo sapiens sapiens, which means smart. We are not behaving as a smart genus in the world. We could become Homo solicitus, which means taking care of ourselves and the future generation. For those who are much younger than me, I encourage you, dedicate your life to this purpose. This will make your life very happy, because happiness comes from this very core of humankind, which is loving each other. If you do that, you will have a spark which initiates something, and all big changes of humankind have been started somewhere. Somebody has to start it. As many people we start, the earlier we start, the better. The earlier we start the ceasefire and we obtain a ceasefire in Ukraine, the better for the whole world, in particular for the poor countries who have been affected by this very high price of oil and food. And they are calling for justice. They are crying for justice. Please help them.
Yes, wonderful. That's wonderful. And as you know, Dr. Calvani, we're committed to bringing restorative justice to bear now, if we can, in any way. And we so appreciate your wisdom today and sharing it. And we'll continue to work on this. And we encourage those that are listening to join us if they want to be a part of this effort. So thank you so much for being on the council and for sharing your words today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And this is Lisa Ray for RJI.